Hey there, listeners. Brennan here. Ordinarily, this is an off week for the show, but as I've got something new I want to share with you, I thought we would do a special release. Recently, we've had a few people write in and ask about the Sunken Library, which they've heard me reference several times on the more recent shows. The Sunken Library is a brand new patron-only show that I started doing in late December and release now twice a month, usually at the beginning of the month and again at the end. It's a place where we can share stories that are too long for the main show, especially listener stories, or just explore topics that don't quite fit the single-person narrator style of the main show. Sometimes it's just me on the show, sometimes it's me and Paul, and there are a couple guests coming up as well in the coming months. We're just sort of hammering out scheduling details. The episode I'm going to be sharing with you was the very first episode, and that was called Visions from Johanna, because I am sharing a long-form listener story that we received from a listener in, I want to say 2018. Again, it was always just too long for the main show, but it was a really brilliant story, and I'm thrilled to finally be able to share it with you guys. Usually the Sunken Library is a patron-only show, but again, because we've had people asking about it, I thought we'd share an episode with everybody, and if you want to hear more, you can find us at patreon.com/ghoststoryguys. Enjoy! Welcome to the Sunken Library. Hey there, patrons. Welcome to the Sunken Library. This is a new feature you'll be getting every month that features long-form listener stories that won't fit into the main show. And when I say don't fit into the main show, what I mean is the main show scripts are usually about 6,000 words. Of course, that doesn't include the talk, that's just the stories. And some of these letters we get are really great. They're brilliant stories, but they're, 2,000 to 3,000 words. And of course, I do edit things down when I do a listener story show. Typically I'll try and reduce it by at least a third if I can, just so we can get more stories into a single show. But even with that kind of editing, a 2,000 or 3,000 word story, it's pretty hard to fit. And some of them you just can't edit because there's relevant story details in it. So the Sunken Library is going to be our way of sharing these stories with you. Of course, as a way to express our appreciation for supporting us and to do honor to the listener stories, because that these stories have been sitting unheard really, really bugs me. So I've been looking forward to having a way to share them. And this is going to be that. So now let me just figure out how this thing works here. There we go. Okay. So, this is one in a series of emails we got. I believe there are 3 parts to it. And you will, again, as I mentioned, be getting one of these every month, possibly more than one, depending on how much correspondence we receive. And this first series will be called
Visions from Johanna.
And away we go. My name is Johanna, and I live in Brighton on the south coast of England. Just to say first that I'm a non-religious, slightly cynical, typical Brit in my mid-40s. Experiences in my own house over the past 24 years mean that I totally accept that there being something that I don't understand, but that I feel. As an adult looking back on my childhood with the benefit of wider understanding of life, there are a couple of things that happened when I was a kid that I accepted at the time, but which now I see as being a little other. For example, the little silent girl that I always saw standing in my parents' bedroom when I was about 4 years old. She never did or said anything, but her very presence made me scared to go into that room. It was a new build house in the mid-1970s, and in 14 years of living there, I probably only went in that room about 6 times. Or a friend's house that I used to walk into as a teenager and get an immediate headache and an urge to run. As an adult, I've suffered anxiety and depression, and 2 separate counselors have described me as being an empath, in that I absorb other people's emotions to the extent that they impact markedly on my own. It's sometimes exhausting to deal with. When I bought my own house in 1995, I loved the atmosphere from the moment I stepped in on the first viewing. It felt calm and happy. But there's a story to tell. On a sunny day in mid-April 1995, my now husband and I moved into a mid-terrace Victorian house in a tree-lined street in Brighton. After picking up the keys from the solicitor, we arrived to discover that the previous owners, a really lovely elderly couple, had experienced a delay with their removal firm and hadn't quite finished moving out. As they still had belongings in the downstairs front room, we agreed to start moving our things into the rooms upstairs to avoid any confusion. My parents were helping us, and my father started to walk up the stairs with a box, followed closely by myself, also carrying a heavy box. The flight of stairs is a typical Victorian one, with a large turned newel post at the top and bottom with carved wooden spindles through which, when you are halfway up the stairs, you can see through onto the landing. And halfway up the stairs is where my father stopped dead in his tracks, causing me to bump into him. Struggling with the heavy box in my arms, I urged him to get a move on, but he told me to turn around and go back down the stairs. Frustrated, I inquired why, to which he just said, "I just saw someone go into the middle bedroom." "Don't be silly," I said, telling him that it was probably just the previous owner of the house who had expressed sadness at leaving, and whom I thought was just having a last look around. "No," said Dad. "I saw someone go in and close the door. We need to go back downstairs." Now, just to explain something about my father, he is a very staid and sensible man, at the time a schoolmaster, not prone to joking around. So I retreated down the stairs, allowed him to pass me, and then I proceeded back up the stairs to take a look to see if anyone was in the room. I opened the door. The room was completely empty. I checked all the other bedrooms and the bathroom, and there was no one upstairs. My dad maintains to this day he saw someone walk in the room and close the door. We settled into the life of new homeowners very quickly. This house was only the second we had seen in our search to buy a home, and fell in love with it on the first viewing. There was something about it that just felt right. I was only 22, still at university, and money was tight, so we were very mindful of energy conservation to avoid large bills. We only ever turned the lights on in the room we were in, and consciously switched the lights off as we left. However, it soon became apparent that lights would be on in rooms in which we knew we'd turn them off, to the extent where we actually got an electrician in to check the connections weren't dodgy. As you walked in the kitchen, there was a row of 3 light switches on the wall to the left, 2 for the kitchen and 1 that turned on the light that lit the patio area of the back garden. It was easy to accidentally switch this outside light on without realizing, so when my brother came to stay with us for a while, I mentioned this to him one evening, showing him how the light illuminated the garden and making sure he knew not to leave it switched on. I turned the light on, then turned it out, both of us watching. We then went into the living room and watched a film on TV, returning to the kitchen a couple of hours later to put the kettle on. The outside light was on. We looked at each other and confirmed to one another that we had turned out the light. We turned it off very consciously and returned to the living room with our cuppas. Cuppas is such a British phrase. Nikki, of course, is English but doesn't drink tea, so I never got used to it. So it always makes me chuckle a little bit. That's cup of tea, for folks who don't know. When replacing our mugs to the sink a short time later, we were surprised to find the outside light was on again. We were the only 2 in the house that evening, and had been together the whole time, so couldn't have been playing a prank on one another. Meanwhile, I converted the middle bedroom into a photographic darkroom, taking some time to completely light-proof the whole space. One evening, I was in the house alone and happily processing some test prints for an idea I had for my degree show, when all of a sudden, the central ceiling light came on, obviously ruining the light-sensitive photographic paper I was using at that point. The only way to turn on this light was with the switch just inside the door, and that whole area was covered with a heavy black felt curtain to stop light from coming in. I was working at the other end of the room, so I couldn't have inadvertently turned on the light switch myself, and no one else had entered the room. As I mentioned, I was home alone, and my partner knew better than to just walk in when I was working in my darkroom. It actually happened a few times that evening, causing me to abandon plans to continue with even trying to develop my prints. The next day, my partner and I were in the living room when our cat, a large, placid Persian, suddenly woke and jumped down from his spot on the sofa. He made a weaving movement in the middle of the floor, meowing and purring, and looking up at something he could evidently see, but we couldn't. His whole demeanor, his actions, and the noises he was making were exactly what he usually did when he was hungry and about to be fed. It was a strange sight, but he was clearly very happy, and while we were puzzled, we didn't feel anything untoward was going on. Shortly after all of this, I happened to bump into the chap from whom we bought the house. We had a lovely chat, and then I plucked up the courage and asked, "So, when you lived here, did you experience anything strange?" It felt like a silly question, but he immediately replied, "The old lady." He then went on to tell me that when his wife suffered from a bad back, she would sometimes spend the night in the middle bedroom, so as not to disturb the rest of the household if she had to get up. In there, she said she was often visited by an old woman who sat at the end of the bed. She couldn't quite make out who she was, but as she always felt an immediate calm when she appeared, concluded that it was the spirit of her mother or some other benevolent relative who was watching over her. I was amazed. We always felt a sense of welcoming contentment in the house, so we were more intrigued than worried. And the room in which the previous owners had this sighting was the one that my father swore he saw someone walk into the day we moved in. The years went past and we did never experience anything untoward. The occasional light on, but nothing much else. We pretty much almost forgot about the lady, and the room was returned to being a bedroom when our daughter was born at the end of 2001. Man, I was just getting out of high school. Yikes. She was a very, very easy baby, sleeping through the night from an early age. As a toddler graduating out of a cot and into a little kid's bed, we would tuck her into bed in the evening, and she would stay put until the morning, unlike our friends' children who would be up and down like yo-yos in the middle of the night. When she was about 3, I praised her one day for being such a good girl for sleeping all night, to which she replied, "I do wake up sometimes, but the old lady shushes me back to sleep." It's important to note that my daughter knew nothing about the old lady or anything happening around the house. It's not something that we'd even thought about much, let alone telling a 3-year-old. I had to act very nonchalant to find out more. Apparently, the old lady sat at the end of the bed sometimes and just kept watch, giving our daughter nice dreams. We did not make a big deal out of this, but, well, it was quite a revelation. My daughter reiterated this to our GP at a checkup a few months later. For those of you who don't speak British, GP is doctor, stands for general practitioner. She told him that sometimes in the night she floated on the ceiling looking down at her sleeping body in bed, which was great fun. Thankfully, our GP at the time was open to all alternatives and asked her to explain more. She turned to me and told me that a particular teddy we thought we had lost was actually on top of the wardrobe in her room, and that she had seen it when she was floating up at the ceiling. Of course, as soon as we got home, I grabbed a chair and stood on it to try and peer what might be on the top of the almost floor-to-Victorian ceiling height wardrobe, and there was a teddy. I was a little freaked, but my daughter wasn't, and so I decided I would just let this be what it was and not question it too much. Over the years, we've had occasional, "oh, it must be the old lady" conversations when lights went on or when keys went missing, only to turn up somewhere we'd already looked. I even got into the habit of saying, "Can you please put my keys back, thanks?" Or when the bathroom light goes off when I'm having a soak in the bath, "Can you please put the light back on? Thanks." And it always works. The house has never felt anything other than a nice place to be, and so we've never been worried. Then in November last year, we redecorated the front living room and bought a new sofa and armchair from that popular Swedish store. We have a big square bay window, and the armchair was positioned in part of that space. The day after it was delivered, I had popped out in the car to run errands, and on returning home I had slowed to a stop right outside in preparation to parallel park. I caught a movement in the front window of our house, so paused parking to see what it was. I clearly saw the back of a man's head sitting in the armchair in the window. He had dark hair and a smart-looking jacket on. As I wondered who he might be, he turned, looked at me, gave me a lovely smile, and stood up. My husband works from home, and my first reaction was that a work colleague might have popped in, but this is highly unusual, and nothing had been mentioned about this prior to me popping out. I parked and went into the house. As I opened the front door, I called out, "Hello," then opened the internal hallway door just in time to see the living room door, to the left of this, close. Puzzled, I called out "hello" again as I knocked on the living room door and opened it with the intention of offering to make my husband and his guest a cup of tea. But the room was totally empty. No one was in there. At this point, having heard me calling out, my husband emerged from his study at the back of the house upstairs and came down, querying who I was talking to. I definitely saw someone, and I saw the door close. My husband and I could only conclude that the old lady had a friend round to visit. Subsequently, our 3 cats sit right on the edge of the seat of that armchair, as if they are squidged up next to someone sitting there. They sit there and purr as if someone is making a fuss of them. We really outgrew this house several years ago, but have always felt that the atmosphere is so nice that it would be a shame to move. We can't explain what it is or what is happening, but would like to attribute it to residual previous happiness from past owners. A few years ago, some neighbors and I looked into the history of our road for our annual street party, and I did find the names of the people who had lived in our house over the past 100-odd years, but didn't delve too deep. One neighbor in his 80s has lived in the street for 60 years, and as an ex-policeman, knows of at least 1 murder and a couple of suicides, as well as natural deaths in the road. He assures me that the murder was not in my house, but I think I already knew that from the good rather than the bad feeling radiating throughout the place. Incidentally, that neighbor also claims to see a young girl on the landing of his house most nights. A story for another time, perhaps? And that was Visions from Johanna, Part 1. Straight from the archives down here in the Sunken Library. You can only store so much stuff in a tiny mountain cabin after all. Thanks for listening, guys. Thank you so much for your support. And as I'm recording this on New Year's Eve, I hope you all have a happy New Year. And for those of you who are in places where that's already happened, well, I hope the New Year's Day hangover isn't too bad. Now you go on and head back up. I'll see you next time.